So allow me to welcome you in the name of the Yarshater Center and the Pura Institute to the 12th Ehsan Yarshater Lecture Studies at UCLA, to be held by my esteemed colleague, Professor Franz Grenet, on the topic Ancient Iran and Central Asia, Interactions and Shifting Identities. Before proceeding with a proper introduction of our speaker, I would like to provide some background on the Yarshater Lecture series and acknowledge the eponymous founder, the late Professor Yarshater, the Khalchayan Chair of Iranian Studies at Columbia University, and the founding editor, among others, of the monumental Encyclopedia Iranica, which shall be valiantly continued by my esteemed colleagues, Yuezhi and Khalchayan and his team at UC Irvine, the Cambridge History of Iran and the History of Persian Literature, the latter of which is our privilege to host at the Yarshater Center. The venerable doctoral programs of Iranian studies, where in the entire range of the Iranian experience, from the pre-Islamic period to the classical age, were taught, have always formed a pleiad of institutions, notably the program established at Harvard University in 1957 by the late Professor Richard Fry, at UCLA in 1963, at Columbia University in 1968 by Ehsan Yarshater, and in Paris in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, at a host of different institutions, among them l'Institut des Études Iraniennes, l'École pratique des hautes études at the Sorbonne, and more recently the Collège de France. There is no doubt an esprit de corps and academic reciprocity that characterizes the exchanges between these eminent programs, and it was thus consequent as a means further to promote synergies and dialogues in the field that the Ehsan Yarshater Lecture Series were almost simultaneously established at Harvard, UCLA, and in Paris in the past decades by Professor Yarshater. With all things ancient being now fully defunct at Harvard and Columbia, the Yarshater Lecture Series are now regularly held at UCLA, the SOAS, and in Paris. The Yarshater lecture series were inspired by les leçons au Collège de France, as was told by me by Professor Yarshater himself, and are delivered by a distinguished scholar whose work has lastingly impacted the study of the Iranian world. Each series consists of 4 to 5 lectures on a single theme that is subsequently elaborated and amplified into a monograph. The lectures thus represent original research and synthesis in all aspects in Iranian studies, traditionally encompassing philology, literary traditions, religious studies, history, but also including archaeology and art history. We are thus exceedingly honored that the 12th biennial Ehsan Yarshater Lecture Series is held by our eminent colleague, Professor Franz Grenet, whose intellectual werdegang I shall strive to summarize as succinctly as possible, which, however, in view of the immensity of his publications, might prove challenging. Dr. Grenet is professor at the Collège de France, where he has served since 2013 as the chair of History and Cultures of Pre-Islamic Central Asia, Histoire et Culture de l'Asie centrale pré-islamique, which greatly emphasizes the impact of the Iranian world in the East. That, of course, constitute the very tenets of the Yarshater lectures he is delivering at UCLA. In this capacity, he has unassumingly served as the doyen of all Iranian studies in Paris. He began his studies at the École Normale Supérieure from 1972 to 77, receiving his agrégation in history in 1975, and focusing on the history and archaeology of Central Asia, as well as the history of Zoroastrianism as his main field of research. From 1977 to 1981, he was posted in Kabul. That must have been the time to be posted in Kabul, as the deputy director of the French archaeological delegation in Afghanistan, and participated in the excavation of the Hellenistic city of Ay-Khanum under the directorship of Paul Bernard. This period led to the completion in 1981 of his thesis Les pratiques funéraires dans l'Asie centrale sédentaire de la conquête grecque à l'islamisation, published in 1984 with the edition du CNRS. From 1981 to 2013, he was a research fellow at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in Paris, followed by his professorship at the École pratique des hautes études, where he held the chair of religions of the ancient Iranian world. Professor Grenet is a member of numerous prestigious institutions and learned societies, among them the Académie des Inscriptions et Belles-Lettres, inducted in 2022, and the American Philosophical Society, to which he joined in 2017. Dr. Grenet's scholarly interests are wide-ranging and encompass a cultural expanse ranging from the Iranian world to ancient Central Asia and China. A constant in his scholarly pursuits have been the study of ancient Zoroastrianism in its Eastern garb and the varied culture of the Sogdians, intermediaries between the Iranian world and China. He belongs to that rare breed of historians of antiquity for whom the world of antiquity constituted a connected expanse, a single tapestry, which, notwithstanding the linguistic and cultural specificities, the historian of the ancient world had fully to grasp and maintain as a backdrop, so that more discrete phenomena could be explored against it. Thus, for him, the Iranian and Central Asian worlds are so profoundly intertwined that he often moves beyond more rudimentary notions of exchanges and connections and strives to understand this geography as an indivisible, entangled expanse, calling for a more integrative treatment of the ancient world. Needless to say, to foster such ambitions at a time of extreme specialization may be anathema to many, but Professor Grenet's extraordinary publications and activities are a testimony that such a view has a legitimate place in the academia, and such pursuits are worthy of emulation. His work is too multifarious to risk an introduction at this juncture. Suffice it to say, his writings, beginning with his by now classical monograph on the funeral practices in Central Asia, from the Hellenistic period to the Islamic one, the one that I just pronounced in French, Les pratiques funéraires dans l'Asie centrale, is a must for all students of ancient history and exquisitely illustrates not only his ability to command over different literary traditions, Sogdian, Middle Persian, and more, religious practices and traditions, critically to assess or innovatively to synthesize them, but more importantly, also to control a most varied material culture and iconography, which are testimony to his grand and wide perspective on what constitutes ancient Central Asia and ancient history in the integrative tradition we just described. Numerous are his monographs, among them the more recent edition of Sogdian documents, the ancient letters and other early Sogdian documents, about which he shall have the leisure to speak more fully himself, the fruit of his collaboration with another eminent scholar, Nicholas Sims Williams, and published most recently in 2023 as part of the Corpus Inscriptionum Iranicarum. His first seminal work, so the so-called Pratique funéraire, which best exemplifies his versatile approach, has most lastingly impacted the field. In this, he expands his gaze in the study of Zoroastrianism, hitherto confined to the heartland of the Iranian empires, more inherently linked to Mazdean beliefs, to Central Asia, that is, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, and brings these faraway horizons into the fold of Zoroastrian studies. Not only was his work pioneering on account of its geographical expanse and vectors, its scrutiny of minute changes in the longue durée, but also on account of its great capaciousness and the author's ability to control simultaneously a varied material culture and equally diverse textual testimonies. In the Pratique funéraire and manifold pertinent articles penned subsequently, Franz Grenet not only developed the contours of Mazdean practices in Central Asia by foregrounding similarities that would bind them to Zoroastrian orthodoxy, as revealed by deed of late antique Sasanian scriptures, but also more markedly underlines the differences of these Eastern variants when compared with the scholastic ecclesiastical tradition of Zoroastrianism in late antique Iran proper. That is, a rich and varied iconography, a plethora of images on murals and objects wherein the impress of the Greek and Indian traditions was entangled with Zoroastrian motifs. From these emerged a new vision of Zoroastrianism in the East, clad in the garb of the Sogdians' religion, which not only accommodated the presence of other cults, but also was inspired by them. I'm coming really to an end, just one half a page. Other signal publications are his collaborations with Mary Boyce on the third volume of the History of Zoroastrianism, entitled Zoroastrianism under Macedonian and Roman Rule. And I would also like to pay homage to his work as a philologist by lauding his edition and translation of a small Middle Persian princely mirror called the Karnamagi Adashir Papakan, or La Gesta de Shis Christe Papak, which is a foundational text for all students of Pahlavi and Middle Persian, providing us with an excellent tool to study these texts, which all my students, by the way, hence here present, have done using his edition. I think all can attest to that fact. I must confess that the list of his publication is a major source of despair to me. Me and many commiserating colleagues who in vain strive to catch up with with reading them. Since reviewing them would require at least a few lessons on itself, I shall just refer you to his bibliography on this brochure, which I have successfully reduced to a paragraph with much schadenfreude. Suffice it to say, I have it from better authorities that his publications amount to 400 titles, not 200 articles, but 400 titles. Samra Azanush has provided this indication. Now, having taxed your patience long enough, my introduction draws to an end. In this first lecture today, A World Between Worlds, Geography, History, and Identity in the Early Kušān, Dr. Grenet shall focus on the structure, genesis, and historical setting of the Kušān Empire as a unique world between two others, the Iranian and the Indian. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Grenet.
Thank you, Rahim, for very friendly words. And it's a deep honor to me to be invited to deliver this lecture, a double honor, because first it's within the framework of the Paul Daoud Center, where I had the privilege of taking part to, I think, was the very first workshop organized in this center in the year 2017. And second, it's part of the Yarshater lectures, which have proved essential to assess the visibility of recent research on Iranian studies. I am conscious that for some of them, perhaps even many, the stories I am going to tell are quite remote from their present concerns. For Iranians at home, for Iranians abroad, and for friends of Iran everywhere, these times are an entangled mixture of hope, worries, and perhaps even despair. My own preoccupation since I started working on these fields was to promote the idea of Greater Iran. I take this formula from Richard Fry, and his recollections were published under this title. And I remember that his book, The Golden Age of Persia, came as a shock for the young students I was then, and probably without this book I would never have taken the path I have taken. The idea of taking, as Hassan brilliantly explained, the Iranian world as a whole, and insisting upon the flexibility, creativity, adaptability of the Iranian culture to other, sometimes quite remote, geographical and ethnic environments. And this research is my modest tribute from a friend of Iran, an Iranian culture. Now, let us start with the topic of today. Well, during the period spanning from the mid-2nd to the mid-1st century BC, all Greek territories in Central Asia, extending from Sogdiana in the north to the Indus Valley in the south, were gradually overtaken by nomadic tribes. According to a vague statement by the Greek geographer Strabo, these nomads had set forth from the territories beyond the Axartes, today the Sirdaria. In the first half of the 1st century CE, these various people came under the domination of one of them in particular, the Yuezhi. The Yuezhi were by origin the easternmost of the people in question, as their homeland was located in Kangju, the present Chinese province to the east of Xinjiang. Further on, the Yuezhi were by origin, the dynasty of the Kušāns, the leading clan of the Yuezhi, unified southern Central Asia with the entire north of India. For nearly 2 centuries, they appear to have imposed a uniform state apparatus over this whole expanse of territory. This apparatus had many aspects, some of which were in a large part inherited from the Greeks. I mention only some of them. An imperial coinage spreading the same political and religious message everywhere. The transmission of supreme power from father to son, with minor accidents for 6 generations, from Kujula Katphises to Vimataktu, then Vimakatphises, then Kanishka, then, of this picture, Huvishka, and finally Vasudeva. This genealogical tree is according to the dates given in the fundamental volume Kušān Histories, which was directed by Harry Falk 10 years ago and in which I participated. The Kušān constructed a chancery using 2 languages, Bactrian, written in the Greek script, and Gandhari, written in Kharoshthi. Some formulae were transmitted from the Achaemenids. The calendar employed in official documents was a Babylono-Macedonian calendar, which had been used by the Greeks. A network of imperial temples was erected, dedicated to the divine protectors of the dynasty. Within these temples, statues of the royal ancestors were also erected. Upon examining these facts, a question naturally emerges. What aspects, if any, of its nomadic past did the Kušān Empire maintain? Prior to addressing this question, it is imperative to establish the chronology. The initial chronology of the Yuezhi migration and initial settlement in the valleys to the north of the Oxus River, presently the Amudarya, is predominantly derived from Chinese chronicles and from embassy records in both directions. These records offer reliable landmarks, ranging from the departure of the Yuezhi from Kangju in 206 BC to their initial settlement in the valleys north of the Oxus in the 120s, and subsequently the emergence of the Kušān clan during the first half of the 1st century CE. Conversely, the chronology of the subsequent Kušān imperial period has until recently provoked a spirited debate, which for a long time impeded the reconstruction of Kušān history in other aspects. This state of affairs proved to be quite untenable, prompting the convening of a conference in Cambridge in 1960 with the absurd objective of determining a compromise date. Of course, this objective was not accomplished. Consequently, 3 systems persisted in their competition. An early system that correlated Kanishka's era with the Saka era of 78 AD, a fixed era as it remains one of the 2 extant ancient Indian eras. A median system, followed here, favored mainly by archaeologists that situated Kanishka in the first half of the 2nd century CE, and a late system primarily supported by certain numismatists that placed him in the 3rd century. The 4 decades after the Cambridge Conference saw a proliferation of arguments, many of which have since become obsolete. A significant advancement was made in 2001 when Harry Falk identified a formula in a Sanskrit astrological treatise that enabled the calculation of the Kušān era from the Saka era and 78 AD. But there is a subtlety here because the Kušān date is actually the Kušān date plus 100. The Saka era is therefore distinct from the Kušān era as it precedes it by 49 years. This places Kanishka in the year 127, thereby vindicating the middle chronology. In subsequent contributions, Falk managed to calibrate the Kanishka era with other eras previously in use in Bactria and Gandhara. These eras include the Arsacid era of the Parthian dynasty, to 247 BC, the so-called Yavana era, which means Greek era, of 175 BC, established by a Greco-Bactrian king, either Antimachus or Eucrotides, it's not yet decided, and the era of the Indo-Scythian king Azes in 47 BC. Furthermore, Falk discovered that the time span between the eras recalculated amounted to hundreds. The Azes era is the Arsacid era plus 200, and the Kanishka era is the Yavana era plus 300. In addition, the era of Kores is probably to be calculated also with a round number, but it's not clear whether it's 200 or 300. Indeed, now it would be more accurate to categorize such eras as jubilees. It is probable that they did not strictly correspond with the commencement of the reigns of the rulers in whose name they were instituted. Rather, an approximate correspondence with such and such a centenary of a prestigious era was considered auspicious at the onset of a new reign, and the clock was reset. This finding substantiates Falk's theological framework, thereby offering a solid validation of the system he has developed. Nonetheless, it is imperative to acknowledge the persistent resonance of disparate voices. In USSR, the late date argument, advanced by the numismatist Evgeny Zeymal, had been endorsed by Boris Litvinsky, a leading authority on Central Asian archaeology, who was in opposition to the Tashkent school, which, more rationally, already stood for the middle chronology, basing on archaeological arguments. In the domain of post-Soviet scholarship, these disputes have now been resolved, and the chronology proposed by Falk has been generally adopted. But among numismatists of the Vienna school, Nicholas Schindel is still a prominent proponent of the late chronology. It is to be hoped that he will eventually realize the sheer impossibility of reconciling it with the counter-evidence for the political history of the 3rd century, which is growing apace. With this background established, we can now turn our attention to the more compelling, albeit not necessarily more straightforward, inquiries concerning the cultural message endorsed by the Kušāns. In this lecture, and in the subsequent one, the following topics will be considered in succession: traditions from the steppes, relations with the Parthian Empire in the West, Hellenistic political and artistic heritage, the influx of Roman ideological features, and the sudden impact of India. In addressing the cultural heritage of the steppes, it is imperative to first ascertain the linguistic affiliation of the Yuezhi. As previously indicated, on coins, on official inscriptions, the languages of the conquered populations were utilized. In Bactrian, the local Iranian language. In India, Gandhari, a Middle Indian language, which eventually gave way to Sanskrit in official use. However, given their ancestral origins, it is hypothesized that the Yuezhi initially spoke a distinct language or languages, evidence of which has been sought in the personal names of Kušān kings and aristocracy. The hypothesis that the original language was Tocharian, an Indo-European but non-Iranian language indigenous to the Kušān and Turfan area, so in proximity to the Yuezhi's original homeland, this hypothesis was once prevalent. However, subsequent research has debunked the claim that there was a similarity between the name of this language and the term Tocharian, which was used by Greek authors to refer to the Yuezhi. Now we don't call anymore that language Tocharian, but Khalchayan, in order to distinguish it more clearly. Another track that has been the subject of significant interest is the first script used by the Kušāns, a script which was subsequently replaced by the Greek script transcribing Bactrian. The early script is referred to as an unknown script, as we didn't know which language it transcribed. But the script itself is clearly an alteration of the Aramaic writing used once in the Achaemenid Empire. The longest testimonies of this script are two inscriptions accompanied by shorter versions written in Greek script. These inscriptions were issued on behalf of the second Kušān emperor, Vimataktu, end of the 1st century AD. They are located near, one is located near the southwestern border of the empire, on a high rock at Dashtinaur, and the other one is located near the northern border at the Almosi complex in Tajikistan, which is believed to have contained the funerary enclosure of Vimataktu. Actually, the name funerary enclosure seems to be mentioned in the inscription. It is noteworthy that the Scythians customarily interred their monarchs in proximity to the border, a practice that was documented by Herodotus. It may well be the case here too. The discovery of the Almosi inscription 4 years ago prompted a debate that culminated recently with the publication by Nicholas Sims Williams of a comprehensive decipherment. Previously, there were partial decipherments from very few bilingual fragments, but now Nicholas has solved the problem and he can propose comprehensive readings. This decipherment revealed, then, without a doubt, that the Kušāns employed this script as an initial effort to transcribe their Bactrian subjects' language, rather than their own postulated ancestral language. In relation to the latter, it is sufficient at this time to acknowledge Sims Williams' earlier discovery of traces of another Iranian language, Saka, also known as Scythian, within the limited corpus of Kušān onomastics. So the ancestors of the Kušān might have spoken a Scythian language, but they seem never to have used it in their official inscriptions. Besides the language or languages, an eloquent mode of self-expression was represented by costume. In this respect, the message of the first Kušāns was unequivocal. On coins and statues, they wore heavy kaftans and felt boots, adapted to the steppe climate, but not at all to the Indian one. Only under Huvishka was this ancestral fashion replaced by the scale armor, which belonged to the real military equipment in Bactria in India. The following discussion will focus on the clay reliefs from Khalchayan. I know some people here are especially interested in this topic. Khalchayan is a royal pavilion. Perhaps it was a sanctuary. Perhaps it was an audience pavilion. It's not decided. It was excavated in the 1960s in one of the valleys occupied by the Yuezhi to the north of the Amudarya, following their arrival. The fragments were found in a fragmentary state, but they were reconstructed, albeit with significant variance according to the authors, as a celebration of the Kušān royal clan in the early imperial period, probably in the mid-1st century CE. This is a reconstruction proposed by Galina Pugachenkova in her first publication. She subsequently amended here it. She amended it from the study of fragments newly cleaned. I still consider that, despite, of course, it's very hypothetical, it is probably the best reconstruction. Subsequent attempts by other authors, such as Marcus Modo, are not so convincing. It is noteworthy that the scale armor is not worn by the Kušāns themselves, but rather by their adversaries in battle. This is a major divergence from Pugachenkova. Pugachenkova reconstructed a parade associating the Yuezhi and the heavily armored Bactrians. Paul Bernard demonstrated that it is far more likely to be a battle scene. And these people are actually not Bactrians, but Saka. So the adversaries of the Kušāns are likely to be Sakas, Scythians, or members of the Kangju confederation itself of Saka origin, which then occupied the territories north of Bactria, mainly Sogdiana. The depiction of these people, of the adversaries, aligns with the physical conventions utilized in Greek art for Scythians in a broad sense, characterized by beards and Caucasian features. The Kušāns and their Yuezhi archers exhibit a series of distinguishing characteristics that starkly contrast with those of their opponents. These include light equipment, slanted eyes, an absence of beards, artificial skull deformation. Notably, these latter features are also discernible on their coins. To accentuate the opposition, a Kušān prince is depicted holding an armor he has captured as spoils of war. So clearly the armor belong to the adversaries. A severed head suspended from the trappings of a horse has been identified as a recurring motif in the war customs of nomads. This motif has been particularly noted on a 4th century BC stone relief from the Taman Peninsula on the Black Sea, which depicts Scythians or Thracians in battle. Actually, these very nice customs lasted long, and when the Shaybanis took Herat at the end of the 15th century, they hanged the severed heads of Timurid princes to the trappings of their horses. The evidence I shall now present suggests a potential historical connection with the Parthian Empire. The initial phase of these relations was characterized by hostilities, as evidenced by the conflict between the Yuezhi and the Arsacids that transpired shortly after the Yuezhi's establishment along the Oxus River, at some distance to the east of the first Arsacid power base in present-day Turkmenistan. This confrontation led to the death of the Arsacid king Artabanus I killed in battle by an arrow, supposedly poisoned as he died immediately. However, a notable shift in the historical narrative can be discerned in the Khalchayan reliefs, dating approximately 1.5 centuries after this episode. Galina Pugachenkova swiftly identified the portrait of a Parthian ruler or prince. This portrait was incorporated into one of the group portraits of the Kušān clan, which included both men and women. This finding suggests the presence of an alliance, possibly including a marital bond. In this context, I once brought attention to a passage in Tacitus' Histories, which mentions the Parthian king Vardanes I. According to this account, in approximately 45 CE, Vardanes was temporarily deposed and sought refuge in the plains of Bactria. Following his restoration to power, he engaged in a campaign against the Sakas, who had established themselves between Parthia and Bactria. 2 years later, he was assassinated by the rival faction. Well, to the right is a coin of Vardanes, and to the left is the head found at Khalchayan. There is definitely an analogy between their hairstyles. Parthian rulers at that period, there were the portraits of Parthian rulers were not anymore did not anymore keep individual features, but the originality was carried by the typical hairstyle and beard style, which was slightly different between one ruler and the other. The hypothesis posits that the presence of the figure at Khalchayan is an echo of this episode of the exile of Vardanes I. If I am right, this episode can be considered an early forerunning of later episodes of Sasanian history, such as the flight of the king Kawad, who escaped with his eastern neighbors, the Hephthalites, who also provided him with a wife and a military force to recover this throne. This is a recurring pattern. This initiative was subsequently imitated by several Sasanian kings or pretenders during the period of the dynasty's downfall, albeit with no success. After the initial shock, there is no record anymore of military confrontation between the Kušāns and the Parthian Empire. The competition was certainly not for the control of the Indian harbors, which were at that time included in buffer states, the Indo-Scythians and then the Indo-Parthians. This peaceful coexistence undoubtedly facilitated international trade, as evidenced by the successful journey of a caravan dispatched to China by the Syrian merchant Maestitianus at the end of the 1st century. The itinerary of this caravan, recorded by Ptolemy, demonstrates the reliability of the route, which allowed for uninterrupted travel through the Parthian and Kušān territories. In the reverse direction, in approximately 127 CE, a Bactrian embassy likely succeeded in reaching Emperor Hadrian, who was at that time stationed in northern Syria. This embassy was presumably dispatched to inform Hadrian of Kanishka's accession, which occurred that very year. This eastern Pax Spartica was abruptly terminated by the Sasanians upon their accession to power. In consideration of symbolic expressions, it seems that the figurative art of the early Kušāns and their northern neighbors at times conveyed resonances of an oral epic literature for which no other records have been identified. On the Kušān side, a bronze phalera found near Peshawar depicts two warriors on foot engaged in hand-to-hand combat with swords. However, the horses they have left behind and the empty quivers attached to the bow cases suggest an initial attempt to engage in horseback combat. Preliminary analysis of the fighters' features reveals their belonging to the Yuezhi ethnic group. However, the presence of a palm tree in the scene indicates that the episode in question, whether factual or legendary, occurred during and after the conquest in India. In contrast, the cultural legacy of the Kangju, situated on the opposite side of the northern border, has been discovered in a cemetery at Orlat, west of Samarkand. This cemetery has yielded evidence of the use of bone plaques, which were affixed to bells. Incisions depict a variety of scenes and motifs, evidently illustrating a narrative cycle. A recent exegesis has been proposed by the Uzbek archaeologist Jangar Ilyasov. While it is admittedly tentative, it nevertheless appeals to me. According to the provided interpretation, the sequence of events begins with a depiction of a hunting scene, which interprets as a competition intended to determine the individual who is best suited to assume leadership within the clan. The subsequent battle scene, situated on the opposite side of the same plaque, portrays a confrontation between two factions which clearly belong to the same clan. Of particular note is the depiction of severed heads attached to the horse trappings, a motif which recurs what we have seen at Khalchayan. A smaller plaque portrays the culmination of the battle in a solitary duel between the primary protagonists. The camels on the other side of the same plate, camels are engaged in combat, no doubt as a symbol of the warrior's fury. Another plaque depicts a griffin scavenging on the battlefield. Simultaneously and in contrast, the more sophisticated Khalchayan reliefs incorporate Greek deities that have been adopted as symbols of victory and charisma, such as Nike, Athena, and possibly Heracles, but it could be a satire as well. It rather looks like Heracles. Evidence also suggests the presence of a Greco-Roman element in the political discourse expressed on coins of the first two rulers, Kujula Ketphases and Vimataktu. Initially, Kujula copied the portrait of Hermaius, the last Greek king of Kabul, with a reverse showing Heracles. It is noteworthy that his subsequent issues copied coins of Augustus, celebrating the victory at Actium, incorporating the features of the portrait and the ruler seated on the curule chair. This is Augustus, and this is a Kušān version. Very close. Very close, but, this significant political homage was both remote and belated, given that these coins were issued 1 century after the original. And these issues, Kujula's successor, Vimataktu, almost always replaces his name with the title Soter Megas, the Savior the Great. On occasions, the face is copied from the Roman March, while at other times it displays the features of a red Apollo. While this temporary and quite spectacular influx of Roman models, the consequence of the maritime trade, which became particularly active during the time in question. This idea is based on the text of the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which documents the active maritime trade during that period. Simultaneously, and in contrast, the Greek legends inscribed on various Central Asian coinages from the 1st century CE suggests that certain rulers still had access to scribes well versed in the nuances of the Greek language. In particular, the very first Kušān ruler who preceded the imperial period is conveniently named by numismatist Heraius, but actually the true reading is Yahu, a transcription of the clan title Yabgu. However, he also had this title rendered a second time as Tyrannountos, a rare Greek word meaning the one who exerts authority. This was deliberately employed to avoid qualifying as Basileus, king, a title he did not dare to assume because, being still a clan ruler, he was only a sub-king. Concurrently, in the Kangju principalities bordering Bactria in the north, certain coins exhibit a strange combination of portraits that are entirely non-Greek in nature and Greek titles or formulas that have been recently elucidated by Alexander Narimarg and Nicholas Sims-Williams. Ashtad, a ruler of Kesh in southern Sogdiana, has on his reverse, well, he writes his name in Sogdian, Proto-Sogdian. But on the reverse, he has a very well reproduced Greek legend, Basileu Antiochou, with the image of a standing Greek archer. This archer, according to Naimarg, is perhaps Antiochus I, who was indeed half Sogdian, and would have been here claimed as a prestigious ancestor. Ashtad's successor, whose name is not indicated, has a legend, Pseiga Charis, an Iranian-Greek hybrid formula elucidated by Nick Sims-Williams, meaning grace of the Lord. Pseiga, Shuyaka, the Lord, Charis, grace. Hircodes, who ruled the principality to the east of Bukhara, has a legend, Makaru Ordiethru, meaning favored by Ordiethros, a hitherto unknown god depicted as a fire god with rooster's legs. I tentatively interpret this name as Ortaya Asr, meaning fire of Asha. This is a name constructed from Avestan formulas associating the fire with Arta, otherwise Asha Wahishta, the Zoroastrian Bonteus immortal protector of fire. Pavel Lourier objected to me the initial vocalism O instead of the expected A, but such a change is attested in Ordi Behesht, the Persian form of Asha Wahishta. These innovations indicate that Zoroastrian thinking was still evolving and exploring new avenues in these remote northern principalities, a development that would rather manifest itself in the Sogdian religion. Finally, we must turn our attention back to Bactria and the remarkably opulent royal graves discovered at Tilia Tepe, situated to the west of Bactria. These graves can be securely dated to the same period as the Khalchayan reliefs. Tentative attributions have been made to Saka rulers who issued coins in this region prior to their assimilation by the Kušāns. However, recent publications contend that defining an ethnos is impossible. There is a deliberate eclecticism in the selection of regalia and ritual practices. They vividly illustrate the diversity of influences of our conscious affiliations, pointing to several directions. The Saka from the Altai, the purposed ultimate origin of the clan, the Xiongnu, particularly the custom of the 6 women sacrificed and buried around the ruler, and the horse skull and small leg bones deposited near the wooden coffin. The Yuezhi, possibly the origin of the main queen. The Indo-Parthians, look notably at the torque worn by the king, which is identical with that worn at the same time by the Indo-Parthian king Gondophares. And above all, the Greco-Bactrian background manifests in the all-pervasive Hellenistic iconography. The intricate iconography exhibited by the ornaments reveals a multifaceted amalgamation of motifs stemming from the Scythian past, where here the ancestral river god, which local jewelers ingeniously amalgamated with Hellenistic elements frequently reinterpreted: Aphrodite, Athena, and here Dionysus and Ariane, with the drunk satire. A figure is depicted wearing a Greek armor and royal ribbon. Two cosmic trees are positioned on either side of the figure, each one resting on an aquatic dragon. The tops of the trees are adorned with a bird. This design is reminiscent of the cosmic hierarchy that is frequently seen on Scythian jewelry. Here, it can be interpreted as a symbolic representation of power, akin to the Iranian concept of kshatra, and anthropomorphically it is modeled after the appearance of the Greek rulers of the past. Usually, the model is identified as Alexander, but perhaps it is rather Seleucus, as suggested by the specific symbol of the bull's horn on the helmet. Seleucus was supposed to have mastered the furious bull. I rather seek the model on that kind of coin. A gold belt worn by the king is adorned with medallions depicting Artemis sitting upon a lion, but arguably, it is a Hellenized representation of the Irano-Babylonian goddess Nana. On the early coins of Kanishka, Nana is depicted with exactly the same attributes: a chignon, a vase, and a lion, here held in a staff. All this suggests, and it will be my conclusion for today, all this suggests that these nomadic chieftains possessed the ability to employ diverse symbolic vocabularies tailored to the varied audiences to whom their messages were addressed. In the next lecture, I shall try to show that the lessons of this period were not forgotten by the Kušāns when they eventually asserted their imperial power. Thank you.